Numa Pompilius strove to inculcate fear of the gods as the most powerful influence that could act upon a barbarous people. But as this effort would fail to impress them without some claim to supernatural wisdom, he pretended that he had nocturnal interviews with the divine nymph Egeria, and that it was on her advice that he was instituting the religious ritual most acceptable to heaven, and he was appointing special priests for each major deity. That's a quote from the Roman historian Livy, who lived in the 1st century AD, and who also showed that revisionist history is nothing new. Welcome to the Western Traditions podcast. When most people think about an episode in Roman history, whether they know it or not, they are usually thinking about something from the period of the Republic, the Roman Republic. For example, the story of Cincinnatus, the life and death of Julius Caesar, the Punic Wars, the invasion of Hannibal, the love story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the writings of Cicero, Cato, and more. These are all people and events from the era of Republican Rome, not the Empire. Imperial Rome came after the fall of the Republic. The history of Imperial Rome includes things like the writings of Marcus Aurelius, the violent rule of emperors such as Caligula and Nero, and the rise of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. Today's episode, however, will review what we know, or what we think we know, about the Roman kingdom, that is, the period which preceded the Republic, when the Roman people were ruled by kings. However, as we shall see, though it may have technically been a monarchy, there was always a tension between the kings and the Roman Senate. The Senate was the ruling council of Roman elders who, for the most part, actually guided the ship of state. Here is what 20th century historian Will Durant had to say about the roles of the king and the Senate in the early days of Rome. Probably the real power of government was in the hands of these elders or senatores, while the functions of the king were chiefly those of the high priest. This latter remark of Durant's about the king being a high priest is an enigmatic statement for those of us in the West today, when religion and state are supposed to be held separate. But in most cultures of the past, the king was always held to be the high priest of the state. That is, the hands of the king were seen as in some way sacred. Recall, if you will, the passage in the Odyssey when Telemachus comes to Pylos in Greece, and he sees that the king, Nestor, is leading the sacrifice there, and not some priest. Now, The Lord of the Rings is a famous work of fiction, but it was written by J.R.R. Tolkien, a man very much steeped in the classics. And if you read this work closely, you will see that Aragorn, the true king of Gondor in the book, he has this quasi-religious bearing about him, and his hands are also capable of healing, just due to being the hands of the true king. So, the way that the ancients actually viewed kings tends to differ from the storybook way that we tend to imagine kings, thanks perhaps to fairy tales and the films that we see. The king in ancient cultures, you see, was more often the spiritual leader rather than the temporal leader of the state. Now, speaking of temporal things, if you would like to support this podcast, please head over to the website, if you're not already there, and take a look at the shopping page where you can buy Western Traditions t-shirts, hats, and more. If you wish to support my work directly, you can contribute using the PayPal or Patreon buttons. Patreon members get access to my Patreon page where I announce podcast updates, publish brief essays, and share other historical resources with my supporters. The Western Traditions podcast is also found on Amazon Music, on Spotify, on YouTube, on my Podbean account, and on a number of other platforms. Wherever you listen, please remember to at least give a like to every podcast you hear. This is free, it helps spread the word, and it will also, of course, cause the algorithms to send you similar content. And now, let us continue our journey through history with Numa Pompilius, the semi-legendary man who followed Romulus at the helm of Rome's ship of state in the 8th century before Christ. After the death of Romulus, there was naturally a period of uncertainty in Rome. I have mentioned before in this podcast that the idea of a seamless transition of power through a policy of primogeniture was the exception and not the rule in our Western traditions. The generally peaceful and respectful handing down of power from father to son in, say, the kingdom of Judah in the Bible is an ideal rarely attained in other kingdoms throughout history. No, generally after the death of a king, there was a power struggle, even if it was sometimes brief and bloodless. Just so, after the death of Romulus, there was contention among the people of the new city that called itself Rome. Those original Romans who had ceded land in order to share it with the defeated Sabines, whom they had let into their city as full citizens during the rule of Romulus, these Romans felt that the crown belonged to one of their number. And as for the Sabines, when their king Tatius had died after sharing power for some time with Romulus, they had gracefully submitted to the sole rulership of that Roman hero who had now become a god. They felt, with some reason, that it was their turn, the Sabines' turn, to choose the new ruler. Now, the Senate appears to have wished to rotate power among its members in something of a rough draft for the future republic, but the people were not happy about this. In the end, after about a year of interregnum, the compromise solution that everyone agreed on was for the Roman inhabitants to choose from among the Sabine inhabitants the man that would rule over them. And the Romans chose Numa Pompilius, the son-in-law of the late Tatius, the Sabine king who had ruled alongside Romulus for a short time. Numa, per the legend, had been born on April 21st, 753 BC, on the very day that the city of Rome had been founded. But however auspicious his birth, Numa was an unusual man to follow in the footsteps of Romulus, a man who, while quite religious, was also quite warlike. In fact, Numa initially refused the office of king on the grounds that the Roman state was essentially still at war, trying to grow as it was while surrounded by plenty of other hostile city-states that were equally interested in territorial growth. And Numa was not a warlike man. To give you an idea of what he was like, consider that his beloved wife died after 13 years of marriage. Yet Numa, unlike most other men who were still young enough and capable of producing and providing for a growing family, Numa chose not to remarry. Instead, he had essentially retired from life after his wife's death, and now he spent much time alone outside the city, allegedly in communion with the gods. Here is Plutarch's depiction of Numa's monkish preferences. He was endued with a soul rarely tempered by nature and disposed to virtue, which he had yet more subdued by discipline, by a severe life, and by the study of philosophy. He banished all luxury and softness from his own home, and in private he devoted himself to the worship of the immortal gods. Indeed, in his monkish seclusion, Numa was said to have obtained a spiritual marriage of sorts with a wise nymph or goddess who was named Egeria, with whom he would often converse on matters spiritual. I've placed a painting of one such imagined conversation on the webpage for this episode. It was from this spiritual retirement that the Romans were trying to recall Numa, and he was apparently not very happy about it at first. He actually refused quite firmly the honor of holding royal power until his father convinced him not to turn his back on the people, who needed a leader to defend them from the violence and uncertainty of the surrounding world. And so Numa came to Rome and entered the city. He was acclaimed publicly by the crowds of people and received into the forum while sacrifices of gratitude to the gods were made. Nevertheless, Numa still refused to accept the robes of authority until the gods revealed some sign of their approval. And here we encounter again the importance of bird flights in Roman culture. The future king stood in the middle of the forum, surrounded by the public, by the gathered people, all in silence, waiting for some sign. And then a flight of birds came and passed him on his right. Only then did Numa accept the royal robes, and the people broke out in wild acclaim of their savior. And so was set in motion the events, the themes, the cultural traits, and the historical impetus that would someday become the unforgettable, eternal Rome, whose memory still inhabits the minds and stirs the hearts of Western men to this day. Yes, Romulus had founded the city, and he had given Rome its first push in the direction of future glory, but that potential could have all been squandered in an ugly succession squabble, when Rome's surrounding friends and enemies might have taken advantage of the chaos and partitioned the realm among themselves. Many upstart kingdoms had frittered away their potential in many such struggles for power in the past. It was Numa's preservation of this young city-state that affirmed its destiny, and with his kingship and in the reigns of the men that followed him, we see emerge many of the emblems and attributes and institutions that we associate with Rome to this day. Now, many of these characteristic features of Roman life and politics and expression have a complicated past, and some may have certainly come from cultural insignia that originated long before Rome. And other attributes of Roman culture and politics may have developed after the reign of Numa, but all have their origin and popularization from this now murky historical era that preceded the Republic. What we do know, in general, is that most of the demonstrations of Roman culture with which we are familiar are already present and common in the Republican period, which begins after 509 BC when the last king is dethroned. Now, one of the most easily recognized such insignias of Rome is the fasces. That's Fasces, the fasces. This is basically an axe wrapped in a bundle of wooden rods. I've included this symbol on the webpage for this episode so that you can take a look at it. Now, this fasces was a symbol of Roman power, but it may very well have been inherited from the mysterious Etruscans. In the opening episodes of this series of podcasts about Rome, I investigated the possible connection between Romans and Etruscans, even to the point of considering that the Romans may have simply been descendants of the Etruscans. Either way, they most likely either inherited or adopted this sign of political sovereignty. Now, such fasces were typically carried about by lictors, which were something like heralds who preceded high government officials when they went about on their business, but they also acted as bodyguards and as personal assistants. Essentially, lictors were the entourage and staff of powerful men in Roman politics. And if this strange word, fasces, sounds somewhat familiar, it's because we derived the term fascist from fasces. Since the fall of Rome, the fasces have been adopted by various groups as their emblem, but most recently this was done by Benito Mussolini and the Italian Fascist Party after World War I. They so named their party as fascist as a direct reference to the great days of Rome's past glory. In addition to the fasces, the king's power was also represented by the diadem. He wore a white diadem on his head, and this word diadem is simply another word for crown, but the Roman diadem was something more lightweight, a little more delicate than the typical heavily bejeweled image that appears in one's head when they hear the word crown. Now, along with this tiara, the king also wore red shoes, and we see here more enduring connections to the modern Catholic Church, in which the popes, up until the last few decades anyway, would often wear a papal tiara and don red shoes for certain ceremonies. Now, you also hear a lot about the toga in Roman history. The king wore a purple toga, but there were specific togas for specific offices in government and also for specific occasions. In the same way, in the Roman Catholic Church, the priests and the monks have different robes and other garments for different functions and for different times of the year. A Roman priest in the past would sometimes wear something called the toga praetexta at religious ceremonies. It was made of wool, and the priest would use the toga's folds to cover his head when he prayed, when he poured libations, or when he made sacrifices. And it's not exactly known why the head covering was necessary. Now, interestingly, the priest would only do this during specifically Roman ceremonies. But when certain Greek gods were honored, they would use Greek customs in their rites and leave their head uncovered. Again, this detail seems particularly pertinent in the context of the New Testament, in which St. Paul, living in the Greek portion of the Roman Empire, insists that men leave their heads uncovered during worship. The king was himself the high priest for the whole state. When acting in this role, he was called the Pontifex Maximus. Pontifex comes from the Latin word for bridge, and some interpret this title to mean that a priest was the bridge builder between the gods and humanity. Thus, the king was the most important and powerful bridge between men and gods. But there were other offices in government besides the kingship and the priesthood, and as in any monarchy, the king probably delegated his offices, likely to trusted men in the Senate. The Pontifex Maximus seems to have been an office delegated by the king to other high-ranking men at some time. But the office, like all government and religious offices, always had its origin in the office of the king. Now, office holders appointed to more secular roles were known as quaestors or prefects, but those who acted in religious roles on behalf of the king were known as sacerdos. That's sacerdos, the Latin word for priest. This is still reflected in modern languages. In Spanish, a priest is a sacerdote. When such priests were assigned to conduct worship for particular deities, such as Jupiter or Mars or Minerva, they were known as flamen. Quaestors, on the other hand, were men appointed, in later times elected, to hold specific offices or to oversee or investigate certain issues. The name quaestor comes from the Latin word for query, so a quaestor was an inquirer, someone who looked into matters for the government, whether that was for the king, the senate, or the emperor. In some cases, a quaestor might be more like a cabinet member in the government, but he could also be a prosecutor in a legal case or an auditor of some sort. Crucially, though, when this quaestor acted, he did so with the backing of the government, king, senate, or emperor. Typically, a man given a very high role, though, he would have the title of prefect, related to the slightly more modern term prefect, which is hardly used anymore outside of certain religious roles. For instance, the prefectus urbanus was the prefect charged with the day-to-day management of the city of Rome itself, while the king or senate or emperor was overall responsible for the entirety of the territory belonging to Rome. These quaestors and prefects would often be chosen from men of the senatorial class, but certain high-ranking men from outside the Senate might aspire to lower levels of such officialdom. Opportunities to walk these roads to government leadership for people outside the upper classes would increase with the passage of time. Now, in order at this time for a man to be elevated to high office in Roman society, it was not enough to be a patrician or a member of any upper class. That was a good and necessary start, but what mattered more than anything, as we have seen and heard already, what mattered most was a man's character. In particular, what mattered was the man's virtue. Now, today, when we hear the word virtue, we think of things like honesty, kindness, mercifulness, patience, fidelity, and the Romans would have agreed with us, but their idea of virtue went beyond these traits. To fully understand the Roman idea of virtue, we must first investigate the etymology of the word. The modern word virtue comes from the Latin root vir, vir. However, in classical Latin, I should pronounce that word as vir. There is no V sound in Latin. It's more of a W sound. Nor, for that matter, is there a J sound. So it was Jupiter, not Jupiter. And it was Julius Caesar, not Julius Caesar. Anyway, we'll get back to the pronunciation in a bit. But anyway, vir or wir means man. We continue to use this root in modern English in words like virile, meaning manly. Now, to be virtuous for the Romans then meant to be manly. But you have to extract from your mind the image of some hairy athletic guy beating his chest. That is not, for the Romans, something vulgarly macho. For the Romans, a man was much more than that. Yes, strength and bravery were important, and they were virtues, but as I have stated in previous episodes, a man for the Romans, or for the patricians anyway, was someone who also possesses those things that we still more commonly associate with virtue today. Things like patience, wisdom, fortitude, etc. So virtue, or manliness for the Romans, meant a variety of things altogether. The now traditionally understood list of traits like patience, kindness, and so on, but also characteristics like bravery and physical endurance. Notice that while I mentioned wisdom, I nowhere made mention of anything like braininess. Intelligence was certainly prized, the kind of intelligence that led to good decisions in battle or in buying land or in sowing a crop, but not the kind of intelligence that meant reading a lot of books and sitting around talking about philosophy or other high-flown ideas. There will be very little philosophy in Rome as we progress through the next several centuries of history. For the Romans, good philosophy was mostly good politics, good business. There was little point in speculating about quote-unquote, the nature of being. They were focused on managing their land, fighting wars, marrying good women, procreating, worshiping the gods properly, and dying without staining their family name with dishonor. That kept them too busy to worry about things like Platonic ideals. And as for Plato's Republic, they had no need to study such a text. They already had the perfect society. Now, I have mentioned and defined a lot of words with which we should become familiar in order to understand the coming series of episodes, but I haven't told you yet about names, that is, the Roman naming system. This system of naming is known as III.07, or three names. Now, I should warn Westerners, particularly English speakers, to not confuse this naming system with their own. It is also common today, particularly in English, for a person to have three names, a first, a middle, and a last name. If, like me, you belong to some high church Christian tradition, you might also have a fourth name given to you at your confirmation ceremony. Now, anyway, the last of these three basic names that we have is your paternal name, the name of your father's family. And usually then the first and the middle name are given at birth or at your baptism or at the time you're registered with the government. In other Western traditions, such as the Spanish naming system, there is a fourth name or a second last name, which is really just the person's maternal name. That is, it's their mother's last name. So when you hear someone is named Miguel Ricardo Gutierrez Duarte, Gutierrez was his father's family name and Duarte was his mother's. You can achieve the same thing if you're an English speaker by simply adding your mother's last name to your own as a fourth name, and you get the same arrangement. But the Roman naming system, the III.07, has nothing to do with this, really. The three names that most Romans had are broken down into the praenomen, the nomen, and the cognomen. Praenomen, the first name of a Roman man, was something like our own system of given names. The parents gave a praenomen to their child on the 8th day after birth if it was a girl, or on the 9th day if it was a boy. And on this day, the child was purified in a religious ritual, not unlike how Christian children are baptized today. Yet these praenomen were unlike our own first names in that they were rarely used, and then typically only by people within your close family. They were usually not how you were addressed in the regular world while interacting with others. And while there is some record of women receiving these praenomen, the tradition of giving praenomen to women seems to have fallen off centuries before the entire tria nomina system disappeared entirely, sometime during the early Middle Ages. And there were not a lot of praenomen. There were maybe 36 total male praenomens to choose from in the early years of Rome. And by the 1st century BC, there were apparently only 12 left in circulation. Examples of these praenomen include names like Agrippa, Gaius, Gnaeus, Lucius, Marcus, and Octavius. Nor was there any sort of silliness associated with choosing a name like there is now, where people spend hours and days looking in books trying to figure out what to name their kids. A firstborn son would generally receive the same praenomen as his father, and any sons born after him would be named after uncles or cousins, etc. A particular family might only make use of 3 or 4 total praenomen down through the centuries, with nearly everyone just running around with the same handful of praenomens. In fact, there is a well-known praenomen among the Romans from this time, sextus. Sextus means sixth in Latin. It is speculated that this praenomen simply resulted from some family having 6 sons, and having run out of possible names, they simply named him sixth, and the trend caught on. The second name in this naming system, in the tria nomina, was simply the nomen, the name. This was your family name, in the same way that I am named Robert Paxton, and my family name, my paternal name, that is the name of my father's family, my nomen is Paxton. Examples of Roman nomens were Aurelius, Claudius, Fabius, and Julius. That's right, the Julius in Julius Caesar was actually the family name and not the man's particular name. It was not how he was addressed by friends. It was his paternal name, or his last name in modern English custom. Caesar's praenomen, if you are curious, was Gaius, so he was Gaius Julius Caesar. Finally, each individual had a cognomen, the name by which he was known. You can see the root of cognoscere, the Latin verb meaning to acquire knowledge about or to get to know, combined with the Latin word for name, cognomen. The cognomen, in some ways, was a sort of nickname, right? It was the name you were known by. But the cognomens also became hereditary, and in some cases came to indicate the specific branch of a family to which one belonged within the greater family indicated by the nomen. So Gaius Julius Caesar belonged to a branch of the Julian family known by the cognomen Caesar. And there were actually a bunch of guys running around with the same name, because there just weren't that many names to choose from. And of course, actually, it wasn't pronounced Caesar, but I think it will be too jarring after us being so accustomed to the name Caesar to start pronouncing it in classical Latin as Caesar. But, and here's another little digression, if the properly pronounced name of Caesar, Kaiser, sounds oddly familiar, it's because that is what the Germans were calling their leader in World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm. You may have thought that it was just some strange German word for leader, but they were actually applying the Latin word Caesar, properly pronounced Kaiser, to their leader, because he was the new Caesar for them, the new emperor. Now anyway, a cognomen could also be earned and added as a fourth name, or it could replace your original cognomen. Scipio Africanus of Punic War fame was actually known originally as Publius Cornelius Scipio before his military successes in Africa, after which he was known as Scipio Africanus. Thus, this naming system was usually, but not always, respected, and there were exceptions and instances in which praenomen were also used as nomen, etc. But the tria nomina is generally a good way to understand most Roman names that you encounter in history. Of course, at the beginning especially, this was more of a naming system for the upper classes, and we have less of an idea about how commoners were named, since they tend to pass anonymously beneath our historical microscope, as we usually, for better or worse, are interested only in the deeds and the words of the upper classes who lived in the ancient world. Now, speaking of the upper class, we should also talk about class divisions in ancient Rome as well. We have heard about the patricians already. They were the wealthiest class, the Roman 1%, so to speak. In the beginning, to them were reserved seats in the Senate and the highest political offices. There was another class of Roman citizen known as the equites, which might be translated as knights or horsemen, more literally from the Latin word equus, meaning horse. These were men who could afford a horse, to buy a horse, but they were able to do so because they were the business class. They had more wealth than the other commoners. You could think of them as the middle class, but it would not have been as sizable a portion of the population as a modern Western middle class. More likely, it would have been just a few more percentage points of population than the patrician class. These were men who aspired to enter the patrician class in much the same way as middle-class people today might aspire, through hard work, marriage, or luck, to gain their way into the patrician class and become one of the 1%ers. Commoners made up most, but not all, of the rest of the Roman population, and amazingly, at the start, these commoners were not considered, quote-unquote, the people. That is, when the Romans spoke of the populus, the population, the people, they were only referring to the patricians and possibly the equites or knightly class as well. The plebs were all those regular working men and their families, the carpenters, masons, farmers, storekeepers, etc. They didn't count as people. Now, over time, these commoners, called the plebs by the Romans, would gradually become accepted as quote-unquote people, but that would take centuries. And this should not actually surprise us, though. It was the custom, not just for ancient people, but up until very recently, actually, for even modern nations, not to consider the working class, or the average person anyway, as a citizen. In the 20th century, when you heard the titles of communist countries, in particular, when they used language such as, quote-unquote, the People's Republic, this was never even intended as a reference to the entire population of a country. Now, critics of socialism would try to call out the communists for hypocrisy because they were not democracies, but they were democracies in the traditional sense. They were democracies of the people who counted as people. In these cases, the people meant simply the individuals who were officially recognized members in the Communist Party, which was always a limited number of individuals. And don't forget that the same was also true in the young United States. We the people, the famous phrase from the American Declaration of Independence, did not refer to the whole population, nor was it ever meant to, but rather, for the most part, this phrase referred to adult males who owned land and could vote in the assemblies that ruled over the colonies. It was only over the course of decades after the Revolution that universal white male suffrage became common. Black men did not have voting rights until 80 years after the writing of the U.S. Constitution, and women did not get the vote until 1920, nearly a century and a half after the people declared independence. Anyway, from this early phase of Roman life, we also get the famous acronym SPQR, which you can see in many places in references to Rome. If you look closely, you can see that it's on the painting of Numa in Egeria that I posted on the website as well. Now, SPQR stands for Senatus Populusque Romanus, in English, the Senate and the people of Rome. Such an emblem would be attached to documents and engraved on walls and pillars to declare that something had the support of the entire government of Rome. But the people part of that phrase, initially, only represented a small portion of what we would call the true population of Rome. And among the population, there was another large class of quote-unquote individuals, which I'll say just to avoid using terms like citizen or people in this situation. These individuals were the slaves and the freedmen. The slaves would never be counted as people, and for freedmen, that is, emancipated slaves, the rocky road to recognition would take several hundred years to travel. And again, this is not unusual when compared to other societies. The supposed democracy of Athens was actually composed demographically of more non-voting slaves than it was of citizens, even during the time of Socrates. But in the West, the story of the last centuries before Christ, however, is very much a story in which various societies grudgingly accept the quote-unquote personhood of the lower classes. Regardless, though, at the start of things, those who were counted among the populus in Rome were recognized as belonging to three tribes: the Ramnes, the Titiaes, and the Luceres. The Ramnes were most likely the original Romans, whoever they were, while the Titiaes was probably the tribe of those Sabines who had been accepted into Roman society early on. The Luceres may have been the Etruscan element of early Roman society, but there's a lot of uncertainty about that matter. Initial membership in these three tribes may have been limited only to patricians, if you can believe that, but probably expanded to include the equites class as time passed. The lower class plebs, the actual demographic majority of the kingdom, were not considered to be among any of these tribes. Now, the tribes were further broken down into curiae, that's C-U-R-I-A-E, curiae, a word meaning assembly or group. Each curiae was initially composed of about 30 adult men, and I think it's sort of reminiscent of the way that Spartan men belonged to those clubs which would eat together and fight together for their entire lives, and which carefully guarded their membership. Now, one great organization to which all able-bodied men of the upper classes belonged was the legions. The legions were also a very important part of Roman society, but I will save description of the legions' formations and members for the first episode and the next unit of episodes, which will be about the Republic of Rome. Keep in mind, though, that any hard and fast definitions of all these things, these offices, these roles, these organizations, these definitions, these classifications, they will all eventually change, evolve, break down, and even disappear as the history of Rome develops, as the commoners gain more power, and the institutions that once supported the Roman state begin to lose public respect, and the nervous populus looks increasingly to dictators, or men with dictatorial powers anyway, even if they did not possess the actual title of dictator, to preserve the welfare of the SPQR. Numa Pompilius is credited, according to legend, with instituting many features and improvements of Roman life and culture. To him, Plutarch attributes the first attempt to regularize the calendar. Apparently, prior to Numa, the people of Rome had a calendar of only 360 days, and they had no understanding of the cycles of the sun and the moon. Numa reordered the months, and he allegedly ended the tradition of starting the year in March and made the turn of the year fall on January 1st instead. Previously, the years in Rome and in many other cultures had begun in March because that was the month on which the spring equinox occurred. Numa is credited with a number of other calendar changes as well, including the addition of extra days on every second year to keep the calendar in sync with the seasons. He also helped to reorganize Roman society to further lessen factions among the patricians and the people. I mentioned earlier that Plutarch, in his essays, he paired Numa with Lycurgus, the stern lawgiver of the Spartans. However, Plutarch does this by way of contrast as well as by way of comparison. Plutarch notes that both of these men were lawgivers, but Numa's laws are kinder and more inclusive, seeking to encourage harmony through mutual respect rather than obedience through fear. Numa's reign was, however, but a brief respite from the warlike nature of early Roman culture. According to the legends of Rome's kings, Numa ruled for 43 years, dying in 672 BC. 43 years is a long reign, and that's another thing about the king list of early Rome that makes historians suspicious of the history of the Roman kingdom. This history may have been tampered with after the Gauls sacked the city in 390 BC, and all official records of previous eras were lost. It seems unusual for virtually all the kings to have such long, uninterrupted reigns. However that may be, Numa was followed on the throne of Rome by a man named Tullus Hostilius. As the name suggests, he was a more warlike man than Numa. Tullus Hostilius renewed hostilities with Alba, the realm which had warred against Rome when it was under Romulus. Now, it seems strange that there is virtually no mention of hostilities under Numa, who reigned for more than 40 years. That is an extremely long period of peace for any nation, ancient or modern. I mean, in the United States, we consider ourselves pretty accustomed to peace, but we've been at war at least every couple decades since World War I. And then suddenly, with the rise of a new king in Rome, Tullus, hostilities break out again. This sort of scheme and the ordering of Rome's kings is another thing that makes historians kind of suspicious of the whole arrangement. Regardless, it does appear likely that during this time period anyway, as a result of Tullus's wars, that the region of Alba Longa came under Roman control as a vassal state of sorts. Alba Longa would have been one of many neighboring realms to the southeast of the original city of Rome, and this is going to characterize much of the early history of Rome as they expand and turn these neighboring realms into colonies or subject states. Tullus is said to have ruled for 32 years, and again, that's a long rule for any king, especially one who was reputedly in so many battles, but make of it what you will. Tullus was followed on the throne by Ancus Marcius, who ruled for 24 more years. He was a grandson of Numa Pompilius. This king expanded Rome greatly and founded the port city of Ostia on the Tyrrhenian Sea, giving Rome maritime access. He also reputedly oversaw the building of the first bridge across the Tiber River. Nevertheless, when I say that Rome expanded greatly at this time, you've got to limit your understanding of size here. Rome had begun, even under the great Romulus, as a very small city on the banks of a bend in the Tiber River in west-central Italy. Even by the end of the reign of the fourth king, Roman expansion had probably only acquired territory that wasn't much bigger than the actual sprawl of the modern city today. Still, for its time and location, that was a sizable kingdom, and Rome's institutions and its martial discipline probably made it a much more fearsome enemy than its size might imply. The fifth king of Rome was an Etruscan man by the name of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. However, his background is confusing because he also allegedly had a Greek father who hailed from Corinth originally, and the family had moved to Etruria, the Etruscan homeland to the north of Rome. Regardless, this Lucius Tarquinius ruled for 38 years, and the expansion of Rome continued, as it would continue unabated for 7 or 8 more centuries. Legend credits this Lucius Tarquinius with the construction of the Circus Maximus, the great stadium in which the famous games of Rome would occur. Now, apparently, this Etruscan king was assassinated by the sons of the previous king, Ancus Marcius, who felt that they had the right to the throne. But in the tumult that followed, a man named Servius Tullus rose to power. Now, there's controversy about his ascension and lots of confusion. Some sources tell us that he was the first man to take the kingship on his own without being elected and approved beforehand by the Senate. But there are other sources that say that he was actually the first to be so elected. His background is intriguing as well. He was apparently the son of a prince whom the previous king, Lucius Tarquinius, had defeated in war. And the boy, Servius Tullius, had been brought into the royal household and raised to manhood among the king's children. And then, in the chaos following the assassination, he had, one way or another, seized power. Regardless of the truth of the matter, controversy was part and parcel of his rule. According to the stories, he was often in conflict with the patrician class. Servius reorganized the demographics of Rome, and according to some sources, it was actually he, Servius Tullius, who created the middle class, the equites, by raising up certain wealthy members of the plebs. And then he further divided the Roman people into many smaller tribes, breaking up those original 3, and this was based not on ethnicity, but on geographic location, much like Cleisthenes would do in Athens a century later, and thus he began to erase the ancient ethnic rivalries that had always disturbed public unity in Rome. However Servius had done it, he had elevated many men into citizenship and even into leadership positions in the new Rome, and thus he had their loyalty. So when one of late King Tarquinius's grandsons accused Servius of usurping the throne and ruling illegally, Servius declared a plebiscite. That is, he conducted a polling of opinion among the people, among the plebs, and he won unanimous approval from them. The royal grandson, who had charged Servius with illegal rule, was not moved by this show of support from the lower classes. He had Servius assassinated and declared himself king. The name of this final murderous king was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. The story of the 7 kings of Rome has a familiar ring to it. We begin with quote-unquote good kings, or at least competent leaders who are admired, but then the kings lessen in value somewhat over time until there is a final wicked king. The stories of the kings of Israel and Judah in the Bible are somewhat similar. David and Solomon start out well, and then they are followed by successors who are often incompetent and in some cases just plain evil. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus was that last evil king, the 7th king of Rome. His cognomen, or the last name of the 3, Superbus, it meant proud, and proud he was. But in his case, the pride was overbearing. Now, the Senate had always intended for the kings to simply serve as a sort of executive over their council, as well as function as the high priest of the state religion. Like any such body throughout human history, the Senate was loath to obey a dictator for very long. The senators had probably killed the first Tarquin, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the 5th king of Rome, and they had done nothing to stop the assassination of his successor, Servius Tullius. But this latest king was an even greater thorn in their side. He forced freedmen to perform forced labor for his own intentions. He went about everywhere with a force of bodyguards. He crucified people in the forum, and he even had many men of the upper classes killed. But he was not a coward. This last Tarquin led Roman forces successfully in many battles with nearby tribes. And it was while he was away campaigning with the legions that the Senate made their move, and the Roman Republic was born. Now, sources differ as to the date of all this. This may have occurred in 508 or 509 BC, but modern consensus today is for 509 BC, for the end of the Roman kingdom and the birth of the Roman Republic. Now, this final end of the kingdom came as a result of a marital tragedy. In the words of historian Will Durant, quote, "Here the tradition becomes literature, and the prose of politics is fused into the poetry of love." The men of the legions were away fighting the Rutuli, maybe 30 kilometers to the southeast of Rome. In their camp one night, a group of high-born men were discussing and comparing the virtues of their wives. Each man naturally insisted on the superiority of his own wife, and they could not elect any female champions in this contest of virtue just by way of discussion. So the men in the group returned to Rome to visit their wives in the late hours of the night and to surprise them in whatever activity was keeping them busy while their husbands were away. All the wives, except one, were found to be busily feasting with friends and enjoying themselves frivolously. But Lucretia, the wife of a man named Collatinus, she was busy at her traditional task of patrician wives, spinning wool in order to make clothing for her husband. Now, besides clearly winning this contest of virtue, Lucretia, in that moment, also won the secret love of one of her husband's friends, who had been disappointed in his own wife's frivolity. Here was a true Roman wife, an attractive, submissive, and obedient woman sacrificing her free time to support her husband's needs. The man's name was Sextus, and he was overcome with desire for Lucretia. A few nights later, unable to control himself after days of thinking about the woman, Sextus returned to Rome and offered her his love. When she refused him, he became angry. He told Lucretia that if she didn't physically surrender to him now, he would kill her and one of her male slaves, and then tell her husband that he had caught the two of them in the act of adultery and that he had executed both of them on the spot, which was permitted under Roman law. So Lucretia gave in, and she let Sextus have his pleasure with her. When he got up and left, she sent her servants to summon her father and her husband Collatinus. In what must have been a gut-wrenchingly emotional scene, she told them what had happened, and despite her father and husband's protests, Lucretia stabbed herself to death. Now, how did this tragedy bring about the end of the Roman kingdom and bring forth the Roman Republic? Well, Sextus was the perpetrator's praenomen. His nomen was Tarquinius, and he was the son of the king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. As a matter of fact, the nomen of Lucretia's husband, Collatinus, was also Tarquinius, and he was a cousin to the king's family. A friend of the now widowed Collatinus, who must have been overcome with grief, went to the Senate with the story. And this friend's name was Lucius Junius Brutus, and he had his own axe to grind with the king. His father and brother had been put to death by the king, and Brutus, in fact, had earned his cognomen by pretending to be a lunatic and making it unnecessary to kill him. This is why he had the cognomen Brutus, or Brute, someone lacking wit. If this story seems familiar, in the Bible, David also pretends to be a madman in the presence of the Philistine king of Gath in order to avoid detection and execution. The Senate was appalled by the story that Brutus told them, and they ordered the king and his immediate family to be banished. The king, by then, had learned of the scandal, and he was on his way back to Rome. So Brutus rode out to the army and told them the story. The legions then also revolted against the king. King Tarquinius, now without ally among Senate or army, then fled north to Etruria, the land of the Etruscans. Here he would appeal for aid and gather from among his allies an army of vengeance. In the meantime, in Rome, Tarquinius had not been replaced, not with another king anyway. No, the Senate had bided its time for centuries, and now it did not hesitate to grasp the power it had always sought. But the senators also knew that no state could function without an executive of some kind. Centuries before, they had considered something like a weekly rotation among their own members to prevent any of their members from possessing too much power or influence. Now the senators made a momentous choice that would characterize Roman leadership for centuries to come. They chose 2 consuls to lead them simultaneously. The first 2 consuls chosen were the aggrieved men, the widower Collatinus and his orphaned friend Brutus. Their first task was to rally the legions and defend the Republic from the angry, exiled Tarquinius. Thus the kingdom of Rome came to an end, and the Republic of Rome was born. Thus also ends the first unit of this series on Roman history. The next episode will open the unit about the history of the Roman Republic. That will be a great drama, beginning with the struggles against the exiled King Tarquinius and ending many centuries later when the Republic has asserted control over most of the civilized societies known to the West, and perhaps as a result has become too large, too corrupt, and too decadent to be managed under anything but supreme power vested in a single man, the very thing that the Senate had abhorred for so many centuries. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.